Very good. Welcome, one and all. Foundations of Buddhism, class number one. Here we have the beginning of a new year. This is a new opportunity for us to reflect upon our practice, reflect upon where we are in practice, where we are in life, what we may need right now personally as we're going through this particular time in history, as we're going through this particular time in your own life. What is it that we can ask of the practice to be there for us? And how is it that we can um, cultivate what it is that we need? So this is some of what I would like to look at over the course of this series. But let's just jump right into it. I'm going to do a little bit of a discourse here. So let's get into the Blackboard. Let me know if everybody can see the screen here. Foundations of Buddhism. Everybody able to see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Excellent. Okay. So credit to vidyasuri.com. I was just randomly looking for some images on the interwebs, found these. So credit to their photography. This is some photographs taken from the Peace Pagoda in Darjeeling that are looking at some various stages and times of Siddhārtha Gautama's life. Siddhārtha Gautama, apparently that's what is regarded as his name of the Sakya clan, born somewhere in this nebulous region between modern day Nepal and India. And here we have a couple pictures. So here we have, this is depicting Buddha on that story of when he left the palace. So for those that may not be aware of the story, the mythological story behind Buddha, his life. Sorry, just kind of checking, making sure people are getting in. So apparently he was a prince, and around the time of his birth, an astrologer came in and suggested that the baby that was about to be born is either going to become a great warrior leader or a spiritual leader. And of course, the king, wanting him to be mighty and strong and lead armies, tried to keep him sequestered away from anything that might make him reflect upon his life and reflect upon some higher aspirations of thought, mind, and spirit. So as the story goes, if we were to believe it, apparently he lived behind these castle walls and was rather sheltered from life. So here we have this image depicts the time when Buddha said, well, at that point, Siddhartha, even before he became a spiritual aspirant, wanted to see some of the world. And so the king apparently kind of cleaned up the streets and whitewashed everything and took away anything that would be offensive to the eye. And so Siddhartha goes out with his attendants onto the streets, and there he sees for the first time the representation of old age, of sickness and death. Yeah. So he sees an old aging person, and apparently this was a new concept to him. I'm not sure how somebody can live some 20 something years of their life and not notice people aging. I'm painfully aware of it every day myself. But these are the teachers. Apparently this marks a significant point of his spiritual awakening. Seeing old age for the first time, seeing a person who is sick, asking his attendant, what is that over there? Oh, that person is sick. Will that happen to me? Yes, that will happen to you. What is that person over there? Oh, that is a dead person. That person has died. Does that happen to everybody? Yes, even you. So apparently these three great teachers of old age, sickness, and death suddenly flooded his awareness. And in response, he went forth. At that point, the worldly pleasures and privileges no longer had any meaning. We can say that he went into some sort of existential crisis, some sort of depression where he just found everything that had came previously in his life of worldliness became meaningless. So he went off, cut his hair, renounced his privilege and position, and went forth into the world, went forth into the forests, where he studied with many great masters that were contemporary to his teachings later on. And he practiced um, many different spiritual paths. There's the paths of asceticism, where apparently, he would be on the bean diet, where he would eat maybe 15 beans on the full moon, and as the moon would wane, he'd subtract a bean until there would be, on the new moon, where there'd be no moon showing, he would be denying himself any food at all. He became quite emaciated. He became very adept at deep practices of concentration and the deep jhana practices. But he found that once he left these periods of absorption, he still returned to this self that, well, felt like something was wrong. There was some sort of seed of discontent that kind of gnawed away at him. I think that's something that we can all relate to on some level. At any given moment in time, we may be having a great time, but just in the back of our heads, in the back of our minds, there's some, it's not quite 100% right. So this is kind of the seeds, literally, of what he developed later on. So deep states of absorption, asceticism. He then one day he vowed not to leave this particular Bodhi tree that he meditated under until he found truth, until he found his awakening. And so here is a representation of him on the fateful night where he's being assailed by the armies of Mara, so to speak. All the depictions of craving, aversion, and unconsciousness were confronted and dealt with one by one until apparently he reached his enlightenment experience. So, what is that? Many times people might talk about enlightenment as some sort of, I don't know, some sort of heaven experience, some sort of celestial, unworldly experience. But this is something that we're going to be looking at. What is the experience of awakening? What are we awakening from? What is it that we're being liberated from? What different types, styles, and flavors of liberation and release are there? As Buddha spoke variously about awakening that is available to us all, there's different languaging that he would use that all talks about a different facet of this animal called enlightenment. So this is what I hope to explore, amongst other things, during the course of this series. And later on, we have this depiction where apparently the gods came, lauded him, say, "Hey, good job, Buddha. Look, you did it. This good on you, mate." Apparently, as the story goes, the great god Brahma visited him and said, you shouldn't really keep this to yourself. You should go forth and teach this, share this with the world." And thus, in response, Buddha actually fell into a great doubt. So that's not talked about that much, but he sat apparently for 7 weeks under the Bodhi tree, and he wasn't sure how it's possible to share his experience. He contemplated and seriously considered just leaving, going off into a cave somewhere, and enjoying his enlightenment on his own. But then that seed of needing to share this began to blossom. So Buddha began to formulate his theoretical lens that later became his work. So, as the legend goes, he spent 7 weeks under the tree after his awakening. He was formulating his theoretical lens of suffering and selfing. Yeah. So, whenever it is that we are in a state of suffering, we also have a very strong sense of self. Yeah. I mean, think of a time in your life where you were in a great moment of crisis and overwhelm and abject suffering, and yet you had a very, very open, lucid, objective, hands-free view of it. Yeah. So there's this idea that the suffering co-arises with a very strong sense of self. Apparently, as the saying goes, if I can completely botch translate a quote from Stephen Batchelor, this ground so subtle to see, especially by those who delight within their position. Right? How can I describe this ground of being, this way of being in this mind body experience in the world, this ground of being that is so subtle to see, especially by those who delight within their position? So, delighting in one's position, what does that mean? Well, another way to translate that is by if someone is strongly identified with their self view, I'm strongly identified with the view. I mean, right now with the polarization that's happening in this transition of power, so many individuals are very attached to their self view according to their political beliefs, their self view according to their emotion, their self view born of, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this strong sense of I am, that at the core of it, there's this suffering component. And Buddha is saying, how is it that I can teach somebody this ability to see through this whole veil and guise of self, to be able to discern that seed of suffering that is at the core of it? And how is it that I can teach somebody to pull that linchpin of suffering out, so that ego structure, that petite personality structure that is organized around this suffering, can fall away and collapse? So this was his question. It is said that during this time he was formulating the early concepts of Abhidhamma. So in the Pali Canon, the early teachings of the Buddhas, they talk about the three baskets. So um, there is the Vinaya Pitaka, which is all about the rules that the monastics had to lead, all of the precepts, all of the ethical guidelines. Then there is the Sutta Pitaka, which is all of the teachings, all of the stories of Buddha sitting down. Thus have I heard, and then Buddha gives his sermon. And then the third basket is Abhidhamma Pitaka, which is later on when, after the Buddha passed, they took his teachings, formulated, structured them, organized them together in particular ways where we're really, really looking at a lot of the subtleties of, well, psychology, through the lens of the Buddhist perspective, Buddhist psychology. So it was said that during this time he was formulating the basic concepts of Buddhist psychology. So in early Buddhist thought, there's an interplay of principles and practices. Yeah. So the basic principles of avoiding harm and cultivating compassion. Yeah? So it's about the actions that we lead, uh, the ethical guidelines that we can train ourselves into. I have a couple young trees right now that, because of odd movements of the sun or the wind, are all kinds of wiggly and all over the place. So, staking some large, thick stakes into the ground and tying the tree to it so that it can be more upright. It's training the tree to grow up, to grow upright. Yeah? So that way we entrain ourselves into an ethical compass, based on non-harm, the precepts. We can go into possibly some of the actual rules that the monastics take on, or many people here who have gone on some mindfulness retreats might open up the retreat very commonly with the taking of the 5 basic precepts of wise action, wise and compassionate action. So these principles. And of course, then there's the precepts. How is it that we can purify the mind? Yeah. So again, this idea of the Buddha, how is it that I can teach people to see through this veil of self, to be able to see what is at the core of what is taking place? This activity of selfing requires the purification of mind. Apparently, as the story goes, there wasn't a term or a word for meditation back in the day of the Buddha. He would say bhavana, meaning cultivation or training. So there's this actually a very practical sense of how is it that we can train ourselves. He would say to the monks, go engage in metta bhavana, or can you cultivate the heart? Can you cultivate the aspirational expressions of the heart more towards kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity? He would say to the monks, go engage in jhana bhavana, go engage in practicing the jhanas, cultivating deeper states of concentration where we're extracting the hindrances and we can enjoy a mind purified. He'd say to the monks, go engage in Vipassana bhavana, cultivating the deep insight so we can get these insights into how this sense of self and world arise and how they fall away, how this source of suffering arises and how it can cease. So it's the meditative practices leading to a cultivation of wisdom. So, it has been said that Buddha says there's two mistakes we can make up along the path. Number one, not starting it, and number two, not completing it. So it's very, very easy in a lot of these kind of mindfulness roads and pathways that we just kind of get into mindfulness for the sake of mindfulness. But there's a goal for it to lead towards a wisdom, a deep wisdom, a deep penetrative wisdom. And that's something that I would like to also cover as we go on. So here we have a quote from Bhikkhu Bodhi. He says, what the Buddha taught. He taught that the Dharma, fundamental principle of truth and goodness, where the principle of reality and the principle of good merge. A person becomes a Buddha by comprehending it in its entirety and then declaring it to the world. The Dharma is the fundamental truth about human life, all existence, reality, the real nature of things. So, the task and function of the Buddha, what makes him the enlightened one, he has realized, awakened to, and comprehended the Dhamma in its totality, and then he teaches it to the world. The Buddha is not a savior in any way, someone relies upon to do the work of salvation for oneself, but rather his role is to be the teacher to reveal to us the fundamental nature of the reality of their own lives and the path to be followed. So there's this whole thing of, okay, applying the Dharma, applying mindfulness, applying this in ways that are useful. And again, as I was mentioning earlier off camera, um, a lot of the original theory and ideas and practices of the Dharma have been sequestered away so we can have this very clean, compacted, whitewashed mindfulness. Yeah. So how is it again, as I mentioned before, to reattach it back to its original theoretical orientation? But we can see that part of the reason that the mindfulness has been tried to separate from the rest of the Dharma is, well, because I guess some people might be turned off by the religiosity. So as the Dharma moved on and Buddha passed away, it began to take on a lot more of the attributes of religion. There's a lot more rites and rituals and practices, tendencies to worship Buddha as a savior figure. This in early Buddhism was not his intention. He was not intended to be a savior to do the work for you. His presence magically somehow heals. He was really to reflect this is the path and invites you to do the work. So, this is something that I very much emphasize in this type of relationship that we're doing here. I'll talk about this and I'll guide some meditations, but it would be wonderful for all of us here to really look at our own motivation and hold ourselves accountable to doing the work. Yeah. So there's a lot of effort that I would love for people to engage in, between the Wednesday nights that we come to the class here. So again, Bhikkhu Bodhi talking about the Buddha is not a savior, but a teacher that's revealing the fundamental nature of reality and the path to be followed for us to take up. So if you might get the idea, um, I'm using this. I put myself kind of in between this um, secular mindfulness movement on one end and a religious interpretation of Buddhism. I put myself in between. There's this phrase that I like. I tend to teach Buddha Dharma as a secular stereological praxis. What does that mean? So, of course, secular, not specifically bound to religious rule, not at odds with spirituality either. In no way, shape, or form am I trying to denigrate, pejoratize anybody's views, anybody's religion, anybody's practices, anybody's cultural identities in any way, shape, or form. Um, my particular relationship is a teacher of mine once said, Buddhism is bigger than Buddhism. Meaning what? The Dharma is an expression of nature. One particular individual came along and began to teach and put a little architecture and structure to their teachings that we see now in Buddha Dharma. But if we listen to nature sincerely enough, if we have the motivation and care for our own development and well-being, it's possible that we can cultivate the Dharma without necessarily following particular dictates and structures. I feel that the Dharma is an expression of nature, and just as you and I are expressions of nature, the very idea, concept, and reality of liberation and awakening is all of our birthright. And so I'm not at odds with religion in any way, shape, or form, but I have this sense of, yeah, there's a secular view of something that's a natural expression of nature. So the Buddha came along and realized it in his mind, body, form, and created teachings based on it. Later became increasingly structured and operationalized, ritualized. Um, how is it that we can find an organic expression of a Dharma that's relevant to you, your personality, your temperament, and your life? Okay, so secular stereological praxis, soteriology, I still stumble on that word. It's the doctrine of salvation. So even though Bhikkhu Bodhi was saying, well, he's not a savior, still there's that element of saving, but that's on our own, it's on us. In as much as a person is bound by suffering versus our capacity to release that suffering. It's a way that we can cultivate a deepening of knowledge of self and world in a way that inclines us to release our own deeply ingrained, deeply conditioned habits of suffering. Yeah? And this final term, praxis. Praxis, I like this one. It's an exercise or practice of an art, a science, or a skill. It's a practical application of theory. So, as you notice, I can talk a bit about these things, but ultimately it's about putting it to practice. How is it that we can take something that is steeped and grounded in deep theory, but make it living, make it something that we can embody? So theory and practice put together, well-structured process of development, born of direct experience. So this is what I'm hoping for us. So let's get into it. As we were talking earlier, many people were spotlighting the Four Noble Truths. So this is a wonderful place to begin. So in early Buddhism, it's often talked about as kind of a centerpiece of Buddha Dharma.
I'm sorry, could I jump in with one question just on what we were just talking about? I love the distinctions that you're making and sort of like the middle ground between the secular and the spiritual theory. I guess I'm wondering, I'm pretty new to all this, but and came about it through the kind of secular mindfulness route. But I just feel like there's so many teachers and so many there's Vipassana and there's all these different schools of thought. And so none of it seems very neutral to me, or sort of the way that you're presenting it as kind of this Dharma as nature sort of thing. And I'm just wondering if we're going to get into all those personalities and teachers and different perspectives, or whether that's sort of like a next layer of learning.
Oh, in terms of let's look at this particular teacher, their school of thought. Let's look at this particular teacher, their way of doing.
Yeah, like even like, Tibetan versus Zen Buddhism and these sorts of things. And I'm just wondering where you stand on that, or where that comes into it, because I love the way you're making these distinctions. It's really helpful.
Oh, good. I'm glad you're finding it helpful, and I think that would be an interesting conversation. So maybe down the line, we can look at. Yeah, I mean, in my personal experience, I've had a bit of training in some Tibetan Vajrayana practices, a bit of training in Rinzai Zen tradition, a bit of training in the Theravadan traditions, a bit of training in secular mindfulness through the lens of Shinzen Yang. So I'm very happy to talk about the Dharma. Well, Shinzen talks about it in terms of the Dharma as a multifaceted jewel, and all these different schools, they really spotlight a particular facet of the jewel.
Mm,
I think that all the different schools, well, like many different systems, all have their strengths and their weaknesses. And I'm definitely happy to talk about that. Maybe in one of these classes going forward, we can look at maybe kind of like the map of the spread of the Dharma, and as it's entered into the various different cultures and the different schools developed around it, really what that school kind of, how it kind of advanced the conversation a little bit. I think that might be particularly interesting. Yeah.
so but what you're saying now is that what we're talking about here is sort of before any of those specific flavors come into play. Is
Yeah.
that right? Okay.
Yes. So this, what I'm looking at, is even before Buddhism became Buddhism, um,
Okay.
where Buddha is kind of coming out and being like, all right, how is it that I can explain this? And so a lot of these conversations start with the Four Noble Truths. So I mean, the more, well, the most modern would be kind of the Western secular mindfulness movement, and of course this is a very gross oversimplification, but the move, then prior to that, the more later ones would be the Pure Land movements. Prior to that, we'd see kind of the developments of Tibetan Buddhism. Prior to that, kind of the development of Zen and Chan in China and Japan. And prior to that, it kind of originated in southern Asia, in India. So this is a lot of teachings start talking about the Four Noble Truths, but you know, uh, a lot of just to be transparent, a lot of, I guess, what I'm using to look at Buddhism is a lot of the early Buddhist lens. How is it that we can get as close as possible to the original teachings of the Buddha, just so we can get clear about some of these practices. So I'll be transparent about that. A monk friend of mine, Dhamma Ananda of Maitreya Vihara, um, a temple over here close to where I live, he says that even in studying the suttas, the early teachings of the Buddha, it's as close as we can get to maybe the near neighborhood of something maybe adjacent to what he said. We
Mm.
don't know. We don't know. So this is our best guess, our best approximation. Um, but yeah, so as I'm moving into the Four Noble Truths here, this would probably be, um, where a lot of the Theravadan or early Buddhists would start the conversation, looking at really what is it that Buddha is trying to say here as kind of a general overview.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, cool. All right. Excellent question. Thank you. Okay, so oftentimes it's said that Buddha came out talking about the Four Noble Truths as kind of this the way that a physician of the time might come out. So a physician might do an assessment of the patient and then come out and talk about, well, he would make the diagnosis. What is it that the person is ailing from? What are the causal conditions? Why how did this person get this particular ailment? What's the prognosis? Are they going to make it or not? Hmm? If so, what's the treatment plan that can be prescribed? What's the prescription? So the Buddha eventually kind of gave this teaching on the Four Noble Truths kind of in that structure. So he talks about what is the illness, dukkha. So oftentimes it's been described that the first noble truth is life is suffering, which is kind of a horrible buzzkill right there. Probably turns off a lot of people to the practice. But if we were to look at Pali, that's the early language kind of contemporary to Buddha at the time, dukkha ariya sacha, literally suffering noble truth. So can we know this? Can we know this experience of dukkha? So as I was mentioning a little bit ago, this little bit of this buzz that's kind of the seed inside that something's not quite right. Robs us of the experience of the perfection of the moment. And sometimes that seed grows and intensifies into towards abject suffering. So there's this idea of dukkha, which often translated as suffering, but really it's more of that dissatisfaction that can be a wider sense of a discontent, to a wider sense of distress, to a wider sense of suffering. It's this whole gamut of something's not quite right. Oftentimes I might say it's that gap between how things are and how I want things to be. And in that gap there, what remains and how do I defend against that? How do I try to distract myself from that? Or how do I um, numb myself to that? Or how is it that I overly identify with the suffering component? So how is it that we can know this experience of dukkha? And then the origination, the cause. So dukkha samudaya arya sacha. So samudaya is talking about the origination. Can we know or see clearly how this suffering originates or comes into being in each moment? How am I relating to it? That might incline it to proliferate or go into remission. Yeah? How is it that, can I see where it's arising in this mind body experience? Is it showing up in the body? Is it showing up in a particular way that I'm relating to an emotion in the body? Is it manifesting in a particular obsessive thought pattern? Yeah? So, can we understand? Can we see directly? Can we know the suffering as it's arising in the moment? And then Buddha says the prognosis is, well, yeah, it's possible to cease this. It's possible to clear out, end this dukkha. So dukkha nirodha. Nirodha means cessation. Um, so in conversations around dependent origination and such, there's this way in which we can become clear about how maybe old, deep, conditioned habit patterns keep coming up that trip us up. That I like to say stress is something that's universal. It's something that touches all of our lives, but how it affects each of us is very unique and personal to us. For some of us, what's the habit pattern? Is it there a trauma response? Does it ignite an addictive pattern? Is there some dissociative pattern? Is there some distractive pattern? How is it that we can know, what our patterns of distress are, and in the knowing, can we form a relationship to it where we can relinquish that habit pattern? So the cessation. So a lot of these practices are about looking at that, relating to our experience in a way where we can let go of these patterns. So part of it is knowing our patterns. The other part is relating to it in a way where we can let go of it or not be bound and shackled to it. So sometimes in lieu of the word enlightenment, they might say liberation. So if we're liberated from something, that means we're no longer bound to it. So whereas we might feel free and good, but here comes this habit pattern of what? Habit pattern of what is it that pulls us down? So part of it is from our conditioning. So can we see it clearly, and can we relate to it in a way where we're deconstructing it? Yeah. So again, this ground of being so subtle to see, especially by those that delight in their position. So Buddha is talking about, all right, this is what we're trying to do here, is see these habit patterns that we identify with unconsciously. And how is it that we can awaken to them, see them clearly, and just allow them to disentangle, so we can become unshackled, liberated from them. And of course, the treatment plan is the path, the eightfold path that we can go into. So at the core of it, this suffering. Yeah, so here is this image right here. If anybody's ever seen this Bhava Shakara, a Tanka painting on the wheel of life, in the core of it, it's this whole depiction of this, originating of self, originating of suffering. So at the core of it, we have these three animals here. We have the pig, the snake, and the cockerel, or the rooster. And so they represent the different facets, the three poisons, as it were. So we can look at this idea, this concept of dukkha, or suffering, sits on a three-legged stool. So these three legs, the rooster, it represents craving. So I've got some chickens in the back, and they're pretty much single-minded. They're just constantly just pecking. They're just constantly pecking. That's all they want. They don't want to kind of play. They have no time for affection. They're just constantly rooting around, looking for the next thing, that next hit, that next yummy thing. So there's this craving component. That's an aspect of dukkha. On the other side of that coin, there's an aversion aspect. So the snake represents that aversion. Yeah, I don't like this. I don't want this. I hate this. And the way that we push our experience away. Yeah. So oftentimes there's this sense of, there's something happening. I don't like it. I don't want it. And we become overwhelmed by this core feeling of aversion that somehow distorts our perception and drives our behavior. I don't want that. And then what co-arises is, oh, there's something over here that's a lot better, in forms of some fantasy, some planning, some daydream, some process, some habit that we might turn to as like, oh, that's the solve. Yeah, I want that. I need that. So caught between the I hate that, I don't want that, I want this, I need this. There's this tension. And then, of course, the third element of the three poisons, the unconsciousness. That's the pig there. So between the craving and aversion, we go unconscious. And then whatever habit pattern comes and takes over, some habit pattern where we identify with our suffering. So this is where we can start this applying, I'd say, some of this idea here of applying some of this work here. I've talked a bit. Let's move ourselves towards actually sitting. I've talked a little bit about theory and idea, but how is it that we can, well, calm and settle the mind? And it's not going to take long before our habit patterns of planning, fantasy, and daydream come up that want to pull us away. Is it because of what? Some aversion that's suddenly happening, some craving, some going unconscious? So this is something that I like to explore in the sitting practice ourselves. Let's look at our own habits around craving, aversion, unconsciousness, and how a self forms around that, and how by being awake and open and aware, that can allow that to fall away. Yeah. So let's allow yourselves to just come into a comfortable upright position. We can engage in a little bit of practice here. I'd like to do 3 bells to start, 1 bell to end. Mm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 106, 107, 108, 109, 110, 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118, 119, 120, Allow yourself to straighten up and settle in. Settling into our posture, settling into the body, and settle into awareness itself. Whatever that facet of brightness, aliveness experienced in mind and body, however it presents itself to you, just sensitize yourself to this. We can begin to open up towards the breath as we practice a bit of shamatha, or cultivating a calm abiding. Classically, traditionally, talk about a narrow focus. So, contact a part of the body, anchor your attention to a part of the body that's actively engaged in breathing, be that the nose, the throat, the lungs, or the belly. And as we're focusing on the breath, of course, the mind is doing its thing. Just allow that to be in the back seat as much as possible. Constantly reaffirming your connection with the breath. We're not merely noticing the entering and exiting of air, but what are some pleasant qualities that can arise associated with the breath? In that first half of the breath, is there some pleasant, joyful, hedonic tones? Something pleasant about filling with air, getting our oxygen needs being met? Maybe a wakeful energy that may come with that. Whatever it is for you, just give yourself permission to notice what is pleasant on that in breath and give yourself permission to feel that. And what's pleasant about that out breath? That second half of the breath there, is there a relaxation response, a letting go, maybe a sense of settling, peace? Whatever it is that's available for you on that out breath, give yourself permission to notice it and feel it. Of course, the mind does its thing. That's perfectly fine. Just reconnecting with the breath, noticing whatever is pleasant about the breath and either the gladdening or balancing qualities. And probably wherever your mind wants to go to, it's probably not the first time that it wants to go to that neighborhood. We can notice that maybe in our fantasy, planning our daydream, there's certain patterns towards entertainment, something nice and fuzzy, pleasant, maybe pleasant fantasies, maybe planning in order to mitigate anxiety, maybe rumination around some negativity. Just notice we all have patterns of familiarity of the mind. And try to leave that in the background and come back into the breath, into the body. Okay, good. Invite you to open up the scope of focus to include this full body, just observing the various sensations that rise and fall in the body. It's free floating awareness like a hummingbird inside the garden, just checking out something over here and then contacting something over there. Just allow yourself to free float within the body. Be curious about the various sensations. We may notice some of them are pleasant, some are unpleasant, some are neutral. So if you want, I can offer this to you as a technique, moment by moment. What are you contacting? And label. Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? Might sound something like this. Pleasant, neutral, pleasant, unpleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and so on like that. Just contacting, labeling, and exploring. And notice, what is your response? What's your response when you contact pleasant? What's your response when you contact unpleasant? What's your response when you contact neutral? Do we have aversion towards the unpleasant? Do we not like it, want to push it away? Do we have a preference for or craving for the pleasant? Do we go unconscious to the neutral and space out? So, this is about looking at our relationship with our experience. As the pleasant, unpleasant, neutral is always happening, how are we responding to it? And can we choose to have a sense of acceptance, not necessarily needing one or the other? Shine this light of acceptance, openness, equanimity towards whatever arises, be it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And then coming back towards simple contact with breath, simple contact with awareness, and just simply abiding in that. You can drop any labeling or anything, or any formal technique, but recognize when you're being pulled away from simple contact with breath or awareness. If you're being pulled away, are we being pulled by our craving or aversion, unconsciousness, or some combination thereof? And by being awake to that process, does it naturally cease? At ease, everybody. Okay, so I like to end classes like this. By the merits of these acts and other such virtues, may we attain an awakening for the benefit of all beings. We bow before those who come before us on the class and to those who come after us on the path. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for your practice this evening. I hope to see each and every one of you next week. Have a wonderful week, everybody. Be safe.